The Mark Thompson Show.
It's pretty special to have a guest in who has the kind of perspective on so many things related to music that this guy does. He's known probably as the Doors manager because I think, and I can even ask him about that in just a second, that's sort of the thing that punches through the noise, you know. But he's been involved with so many great acts through time: Crosby, Stills and Nash, America, Alice in Chains. He's so much fun, and I consider him a good friend, especially for being here. Bill Siddons, everybody, come on.
The real reason he invited me over is I'm his next door neighbor.
It is true. You're my next door neighbor. I hit the jackpot on neighbors, that's for sure.
That's right. I changed his tire for him last week.
This is particularly true, that you have skills that I will never possess. The skills to, I mean, you do a lot of, you could build a house. You've got that kind of thing. And,
watching Chase build my fence, I realize there's so much. He's a carpenter, cuts every board to fit. I realize, there's a lot of skills that I don't have. But I'm willing to take on anything.
That's true. Yeah. But it's nice that you're focusing on the things that you don't have. It's good. I think in life it's really good too. It's good for the mood. So let me get into some questions that I have. The Doors really it's a weird enduring calling card for you, isn't it?
Well, it is because it's enduring.
Yeah.
Somewhere around 20 years ago, I went, wow, my career has been so weird. I had John Clemmer, a tenor saxophone player, first real breakthrough in the smooth jazz kind of thing.
Sure.
He was pure jazz, not smooth jazz, but it was ballads, so it was beautiful. And Alice in Chains and Robert Palmer and just every musical type. Daz Band.
Oh, yeah. Daz Band. Don't tell me. Daz Band that wasn't Drop a Bomb on Me?
That was Gap Band.
Gap Band. What was Daz Band?
Daz Band was Let It Whip.
Oh, Let It Whip. Yeah, that was great.
And Champagne. So I've had a huge variety of artists that I've worked with. But the one thing I figured that they had in common is that most of them were important culturally. And I thought, well, that's really wonderful that happened to me. I don't take credit for doing it. I just felt that it was great that the decisions that I made as I moved along, I got involved with artists that were really important artists.
When you say you work with different artists, what is the work of a manager? What do you do with these guys?
Well, the pat answer is the manager is the CEO of the corporation for the artist. So everybody reports to the manager, and the manager reports to the artist. So the publicist, the record company, the agent, the road manager, accountant, whatever, anybody who is employed providing services for the artist ultimately goes through the manager. Sometimes some relationships, the business manager was there long before me and they deal direct and I don't have anything to do with their financial services. But mostly, if there's something needs to be done, it falls to the manager. These days, the manager is now the record company because that disappeared.
I see.
A lot of managers are running small labels, and that's 100 times more work. Not usually for much more money.
And it's interesting. Anyway, so it's not lucrative, you're saying,
Well, it can be if you really run it as a label, but a label requires consistent product flow and, you need a staff to make a label work, and you can't afford a staff if you're just doing one artist record every 2 years.
How did you come on the Doors? Was that your first?
That was my first job in the music business, and it was a complete and total accident. My best friend went away to college, and he made friends with a guy there named Ronnie, and Ronnie was the brother of a guy named Robbie, and Robbie was Robbie Krieger. And Rich kept asking me to go to these local club gigs that the band was doing, come help with the equipment, which did not interest me. And then one day he called and said, hey, we're going to San Francisco tomorrow and we got a spot in the bus, in the VW van. That's a 3-seater. And we got a third seat if you want to come along, have a trip to San Francisco. We're staying at the Jack Tar Hotel. And I was 18. And I said, no, I got a class tomorrow. I can't go. And I hung up, and I heard my mother say, Bill, did you just turn down a free trip to San Francisco to go to class tomorrow? And I said, right, Ma, thanks. And I called Rich back and said, I'll go with you.
So your mother is the reason that you were...
Really? Yeah.
Oddly.
Yeah.
So you go on that trip, and then what happens?
Well, I kind of attribute the moment to, we were unloading the VW van up the back stairs of the Avalon Ballroom, and there were at least 50 stairs, just straight up 6 feet wide from the alley up to the stage area. And I'd never met the band, didn't really know their music. And so I was going up the stairs, and the band, halfway through unloading the van, the band shows at the top of the stairs, and they go, who are you? I said, oh, I'm Rich's best friend. He invited me to come up this weekend and help out, so I'm helping out. And Robbie looked at me, he says, do you have a summer job? I said, no, why? He said, do you want a summer job? I said, yeah, I got to get one soon. It's May. And he said, why don't you be our equipment guy? And I went, what? And I literally started looking left and right. I didn't know what to do. I looked behind me, and I saw Rich and Ronnie coming up the stairs on either end of one amplifier. I had an amplifier in each hand.
I see. So
Robbie just did the math. That's 4 times more efficient. So you, and then I don't even know how to plug anything in. They said, don't worry about that. Just get it up on the stage. We'll plug it in. I said, okay. And I had a summer job. And then it was time to go back to college. And they said, oh, you can't go back to college. We need you. And I said, no, I'm not going to Vietnam. I'm going back to college. And they said, okay, well, we'll just work weekends, but you got to work for us through the fall. Gee, I hadn't really planned on doing it that way, but let me try. And by the end of that semester, I had failed 4 classes, and I had 3 units of criminology and 3 units of something else, and I got a D and a B minus. And I said, well, this is not going to work out. And then we promoted Rich and I and his neighbor across the street, who had the money for the deposit, promoted our first show as promoters at our college, Cal State Long Beach. And we put them into the gym. And in order to get into the gym, we had to affiliate with a student society. And so Rich, being in poli-sci, political science,
right,
decided that we should affiliate with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Sure, they were big at that time, actually.
Very strong advocate organization who later became the Weathermen.
Right, right.
And who also were very strong advocates.
Yeah, that was the big anti-war movement for Vietnam at the time. Yeah.
So we did the show December 1st. We sold out 2 shows. We held the record for 6 months of the hottest part of the Doors' career, paying them more than anybody else.
Wow.
And then in mid-December, end of December, they said, look, we just fired our managers. We want you to be the manager. And I have no idea what a manager does.
Well, you just booked them into the most successful game.
And they said, don't worry about it. We'll just have a meeting every Friday and decide.
Wow.
And I said, okay. And so I became the appointed manager and learned to trade in real time. And by the way, in order to do that, I said, I have one requirement. I am not going to Vietnam. So if it comes to that, I'm going back to Canada, being a Canadian born and still a Canadian citizen.
Ah, okay.
And they said, we'll pay whatever it costs to get out of the draft. I said, okay. And I went to, I think her name was Beth, the woman that we dealt with at Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and said, I really have to figure out how to beat the draft. Do you know anyone who can help? And she said, yes. She gave me a name and a phone number, and Rich and I went to meet him. And he, is asking a few questions. And I said, look, all I want to know is, how many cases have you handled? And he said, 403. And I said, how many of those went in the service? He said, 3. I said, okay, where do I sign? That's all I needed to know.
Yeah, you just wanted a track record.
And he was brilliant at his job. He knew exactly how to make the system work for him and me. And so because I was a Canadian, I still had to serve, and I was certainly willing to serve, but not to kill people. And they didn't give you an option to not kill people.
Yeah, no, that's
So
just
I
sort
tried,
of part of the deal.
I went to the draft board and asked about getting into, working in a hospital or something. And they just said, you have to prove that you are a pacifist.
Yeah, conscientious objector, is that what they called them or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, but really a pacifist, which means if somebody punches you, you don't hit back.
Right.
I was not a pacifist.
Right.
Close, but not quite that.
Yeah.
So I knew I'd probably fail that test. And
So you went to so this guy who becomes essentially the I'll use the word fixer almost to try to make sure that
he was a lawyer who knew the right shrink to go do the interpretation.
I see.
And the right people to administer the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. And the one thing he said that made all the difference in the world, he says, do you have anyone outside of a major city, and it was me and Rich, he said, that you can absolutely trust 100% to take anything mailed to you and put it in a new envelope, put a new stamp on it, and mail it directly to you? And I went, Rich went, I have an aunt in Great Falls. So we went, Bill knew, the lawyer, that what you do is you sign to take your physical somewhere else. You can say you're living somewhere else, but you can't change your draft board. So I signed for my physical in Montana and ultimately managed to fail my physical in Butte, Montana, one of the greatest days of my life.
Wow. You failing a physical is pretty wild. How do they do that?
Well, I was a drug-dependent bisexual.
I see.
According to the interpretations.
Sure, that's the key.
And in Montana, they weren't interested.
It's all in the
guy
interpretation.
At the end of the line said, "Reject." It became one of my favorite words.
All right, so now you're not going to Vietnam. You're with the Doors. You're their manager, but you don't really know what you're doing.
Right. But I figured it out fairly quickly. It's an endless learning process.
And again, they're not yet the Doors in a big, big way, the way they were going to be.
Well, I would point out that I started May 17th, and on July 3rd, Light My Fire hit #1.
So is that because you were able to...
Absolutely. It had nothing to do with it. It just happened. And I made sure they got to the gig on time, and the stage got set up, and
sure,
and somebody was watching Jim.
So you knew, right? I mean, obviously when Light My Fire hits, but you knew, just as a fan of music and as having been around the band, you got that there was something special there, right?
The first show, I didn't know their music, hadn't listened to an album, but when Jim went into Horse Latitudes at the Avalon, my head exploded. It was like the only time in my life I ever saw a whole movie to words. It was as if I had written the video for it in my head. It was just visual. And I went, nobody else does that. And that was the moment that I went, oh, these guys are really different.
And in a live performance, and I suppose even, it helped just the general profile of the band, Jim Morrison was insanely charismatic and such a handsome, gorgeous guy too, right?
Most people thought so.
Yeah.
Luckily, I didn't have those inclinations.
No, but I'm saying you could tell as someone who was objectively sort of figuring out the commercial appeal of this band, there was that too. Immense charisma on the part of Morrison, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to talk to him. And our publicist at Elektra, the education you get every day, we were getting bombarded with solicitations for interviewing Jim. And he said, I turned most of them down. I said, why? He said, I want the cover. And by the third time they ask, I can get the cover.
He was a sharp guy also, huh?
Yeah.
He understood. Yeah. And he was also, it seemed, and was this just me reading into it, the poetry of it all and sort of who he was? He seemed kind of deep, or seemed like a real artist that was more than just a one-dimensional rock star.
He was not interested in being a rock star.
Yeah.
He was enjoying the game for a while about, oh, look what I can do. Oh, this is amazing. But he was completely, I mean, he was probably the brightest guy I ever knew. Erudite, knowledgeable, and just, I made him stop talking to me a couple times because my head couldn't keep up. He was as deep as they come and completely playful and hysterical at times too. So as Oliver Stone said to me when I went and read the script for the movie, and I said, Oliver, why do you just show such a one-dimensional person and the ugly side of him?
Right.
There's so much more to him. And he said, well, Bill, I interviewed 50 people about this movie, and they all knew a different Jim. And I had to choose one.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I kind of went, well, why did you choose the asshole? You know, because that's what I thought the guy was in the movie. The character they portrayed was someone who, yes, that was part of Jim's persona, that he would, he didn't have a lot of empathy for what you were suffering. He just wanted to make you react in a very real way. So he provoked people as a matter of sport.
And so he, the Oliver Stone movie, help me, was Val Kilmer. Did he play?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're saying that while it's a fair depiction of that part of the guy, it really neglects a whole bunch of other much more favorable parts of the guy.
I went to dinner with Jim near the Troubadour one night, and a guy comes by the table, and he's got a box of silverware, basically. In fact, ironically, I happen to be wearing a ring right now that is of that design.
Is that? Oh, okay.
It's made from the end of a spoon, curled up. And Jim looked at him and says, "This is how you make your living?" He says, "Yeah." And Jim bought the whole box, like 40 rings, and gave them away. He was, he just didn't have any kind of consciousness towards being a normal person. He just, somebody needed help, he did.
He was a super young guy. I think back at because his legacy is such a powerful one and it's so enduring, as we said. But he was a young guy. He died at 27, wasn't it, or something like that? I mean, so that means that a lot of these things you're talking about, this immense success, all happened, when he was 25 or
23.
God.
It just exploded.
It's pretty hard. And this I would even suggest you might have a perspective on, because some of your other clients, I would think it's hard to maintain, like any kind of sort of, magnetic north, when you're hitting it so big, so young.
I read a story in this morning's paper about Louis Capaldi, somebody that I used to know. Isn't that it? No, that was the Australian guy. Somebody you used to love.
Yeah.
Now I'm just somebody
that I used to know. It's somebody I used to know.
I think that's the wrong record. But Capaldi had a #1 record in the whole world 3 or 4 years ago.
Someone You Loved, I think it was.
Yeah. And it was a magical record, fantastic record. And they did a documentary on the mental health impact of what that did to him, and he's still suffering. And you realize, right, you're a poet. You kind of have no ambition. You're not trying to get rich. You're just trying to get better at something. And then all of a sudden they back up the dump truck and shower you with money and everything that you could ever want. You want drugs, women, anything.
Right.
And, there just were no limits. So you have to establish them for yourself. And Jim was not particularly good at that side of the coin.
Well, plus I think that at that time, it was just a sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture at that time. It was exploding as such, wasn't it? Or was that just my sense?
Yes,
of it?
But it wasn't.
Psychedelic culture, for example, LSD was being, all these.
It was a giant cultural change.
Right.
But, the sex and drugs and rock and roll thing that Motley Crue personified, we didn't.
Right.
It was available.
Right.
But do you want to participate? So, yeah, Jim slept with a number of different women, but he was always in love with Pamela. That was his north, as it were.
Yeah.
She was a handful herself, but it was very hard to find things to hold on to that you really want to do. There are some artists that figure out, I'm just saying no. and I'll do what I want when I want. To hell with what it means in the career. And we had a partner in the band named Ray Manzarek, who was quite Machiavellian and was always pushing for more. That was kind of his job.
I was going to ask about the rest of the band during this time. Were they understanding and coalescing around Jim? Were they, in other words, or was there much infighting, or I'm just curious about the texture of the band itself.
It changed quite a bit over a couple of few years. You know, it started out with everybody just hanging on and kind of enjoying the ride, a little intimidated by it, but little by little it got to, oh God, what are we going to do about Jim? Because he would just show up too drunk to work. He was becoming a real, John was, I called him a mama's boy, but he was more like grandma's boy. He had very traditional values.
Jim Morrison.
John Densmore.
Oh, okay.
And Jim challenged all of those values and kept, he wanted to go out and do the best possible show they could. Jim wanted to go out and freak people out.
Sure.
So they had very differing ambitions that conflicted. And so that gradually resulted in it becoming Jim Morrison and the Doors internally, as well as to the general public. Although we never authorized the use of that phrase, it's kind of what happened.
Wow. I wanted to ask you about the alcohol thing real quick. Then I'm going to move on from the Doors, but it's just so interesting to hear this. And I wanted to ask you about whether or not the alcohol thing, indulgence on the part of Jim Morrison, was it your take? I mean, you can never know, but was it your take that he was like, you always hear, I'm self-medicating, that he was dulling some pain, or was he just in the decadence of it, or he was just in the celebration of it, or where did it come from, do you think?
I think the last two are closer. I don't think he was acknowledging any pain or really suffering in that way, but he was Irish. He loved to drink.
Yeah. Excuse
me for being nationalist.
Right.
But the Irish are worldwide renowned for their ability to drink. And Jim, although there was every drug around, and he once bought an ounce of cocaine and went to the desert with his film crew and shot part of Highway, and the ounce was gone in a week. What? Yeah. It took me 2 weeks to get rid of a gram. But that's all he ever did. I never knew him to do coke other than that. He'd try it and see how far he could go. So the alcohol to me was more about Jim just pushing the envelope, just seeing how far could he get. And the first week I went to, when I was first working with them, the first weekend we played the Avalon, and then we played it'll come to me in a second, in Santa Monica on the pier.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim managed to get, they wanted me to come to New York, but they couldn't afford an airplane ticket. So I hitchhiked to New York. And then I got to New York. I didn't have a hotel, so I stayed at the Y. And I learned about gay culture there. And
that's for another conversation.
Yeah. But we did this. We were playing at the Scene, a club. At the same time, Monterey Pop Festival was going on, and the guys would not play a pop festival because they did not want to be thrown into the mixer. They wanted people who were interested in what they do to come see them. That was kind of their mental attitude. And so we did the Scene, and the first weekend we had a gig on Long Island on Saturday night for real money, $5,000.
Yeah.
And it was a place called the Action House. And we got there in the afternoon, and I'm trying to figure out how to get a stage set up, and Jim's over at the bar hanging out. And by the time the show went on, Jim was so drunk that he could barely stand or move. And I was panicked because I was 18. I had no education, no idea what to do with anything like this. And I knew it was my fault. No matter what, it was my fault.
Well, if he doesn't show up or can't perform, then it is your fault.
Yeah. except I'm just the equipment guy.
Oh, I see. Yeah, at that point, you weren't the manager. Yeah.
Right. So I'm panicked, and Jim just couldn't get through the second or third song. Densmore and Krieger walked off stage in the middle of it, and I ran over to the bar and I grabbed the bartender and said, "You serve him?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "How much did he drink?" He says, "I don't know. Let me check the tab." And he gets the tab and brings it over and he starts counting. Jim did 26 shots of VO in 3 hours.
That's just.
I didn't know you could live through that.
Yeah, yeah.
So he pushed the envelope at anything that he did.
When he became embroiled in all the what they considered like pornographic exposing yourself stuff in Miami, I think it
The
was.
Weenie Waiver incident.
Yeah, exactly. You were managing the band at that time.
Correct.
What was what was happening? Like, what was your take on it? And what did you see things spiraling, or did you see it as manageable, or where it was also creating tremendous attention for the band? I'm wondering if there is any of this stuff good.
Oh, well, we didn't think so. I think it destroyed Jim ultimately. It destroyed his desire to be in the business, to be an entertainer. But
the incident did.
No, the reaction to the
the
incident.
reaction to the incident. I'm sorry. Okay.
Because there was no proof that he'd exposed himself, but he
Right.
thought he might have. He was kind of going, "Is this what you're here for?"
I see.
He was challenging his audience. He had seen the Living Theater, a traveling European, 26 people. I saw them too with him one night. He went all 4 nights, and that inspired him to be very confrontational.
I see.
They would walk through the audience, 15 of them, and walk up and scream in your face, "I am not allowed to smoke marijuana," and that kind of stuff. And so he started doing that with the audience. And, after the show, I'm hanging out with a couple of the cops, and I had to pay a cop because Jim took his hat and threw it into the audience. So I had to give him $70 to replace his hat. Oh my God. And one of the cops said, "It only hurts himself. Doesn't matter to anybody else, but the show sucked and he was a mess." And I went, yeah. And the thing was, I knew about it coming on because when we left LA International to get to Miami that day, playing that night, Jim was coming to the airport by himself with Pamela, not with the band.
I see.
So we're all at the airport waiting for Jim. He shows up at 8:35, 8:40, and he and Pamela have a fight in the limo, and she takes off. And so I just told the guys, "Get on the plane. I'll catch up somehow." And I did, but I had to stop in New Orleans. And I noticed halfway from New Orleans, because we'd gone upstairs to the bar at the airport, I looked over and I could see Jim's facial muscles slacken, and I went, "Uh-oh, he drank way too much." That's all I knew. No one had any idea what was going to happen. The gig was complete chaos. Mm-hmm. Some guy showed up that had some connection to them, and he was carrying a lamb with him, and it was just a freak show. And I was going through the biggest nightmare of my career to date because the promoter had made an offer of $25,000 flat, no percentage. We'd never done a flat before, but the agent said, it's basically 60% of the gross already, so let's just take it. I said, okay. Well, of course, the gross doubled, and we were stuck with a flat. I'd filed a thing with the AFFM, and the promoter, I had hired these guys from Philadelphia who'd done a gig a couple weeks before for us in Philadelphia, and they were fantastic. Black guys. One guy was a former lieutenant in the police force, and everybody else was the people he arrested, and they all worked for him. So that was a
wow. What
team.
An interesting configuration.
Yeah, we had like 4 guys come down, and the head guy comes up to me when I'm going through nightmares trying to get paid, and I wouldn't put the band on until I got paid, and blah, blah, blah. And Sullivan comes over to me and he says, "Hey, Bill, you ever heard of the Palmero brothers?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so. Why?" He says, well, they're in town and they're friends of mine. Do you want anything to happen here? And I looked at him and I almost shit my pants because I thought he had just offered to kill that guy for me.
Wow.
And I went, no, I think we'll leave that out of the picture for right now. So it was it was tumultuous in every possible way.
Right.
But we left and nobody thought a second thought about it. And the Monday following, a ambitious reporter had called every judge and every police officer and said, do you know what's happening in your community? And, did the red baiting thing. And they all decided, we're going to do something about this. So they issued an arrest warrant for Jim. And I sent my attorney to Miami to deal with it. And by the way, we were scheduled to go to Jamaica on that Sunday on vacation. We'd rented houses with cooks, all that kind of stuff. And Jim had fought with Pam, and so he wasn't going without Pam, but he might have. I don't remember that clearly. But so this was their vacation week, and this whole newspaper thing blows up in the Miami Herald. My lawyer goes down, and he said, I'll call you when I get there. Now, I understand there was no form of communication but telephone. And he called me. I said, so what's going on down there, Max? He says, Bill, this is the biggest thing to hit Miami since Columbus landed.
Wow. Wow.
I went, uh-oh.
Yeah,
That's
not
a
in a good
problem.
way. Yeah,
not in a good way. So needless to say, it turned into a complete nightmare for a couple of years for Jim because we couldn't, most of our gigs that we'd booked got canceled because the hall managers did not want that happening in their hall. The communities did not want this happening.
It was viewed as obscenity or whatever.
Yeah, well, he was accused of obscenity and profanity. Well, not to my child.
Right.
So you just had this whole culture clash going on, which was really the hippies and the establishment.
No, that's so right on. As you say it, I'm thinking, gosh, it really does reflect the culture, that there was this Puritanism trying to hold off what was clearly just a new generation of, it's tough to be a rebel as a rock and roller if if you can't have at least a little bit of an edge, And I guess he was he cranked the edge way up. But were you there for the Sullivan Show?
Yeah, of course.
And can you remind us all what the Sullivan Show was? It was
at that point in time, Ed Sullivan was pretty much the only national television show that you could get music on, and the only one that mattered, to be sure. And the Beatles had done it and exploded, so it was the big career opportunity. And
where were the Doors in their career at that time when they were to go on the Sullivan Show, or when there was talk of going on the Sullivan Show? Had Light My Fire come out, for example?
Yeah.
Okay, so they were already.
It was already blowing up, and this was kind of the coup de grace.
Sure, of course. Okay. Anyway.
And the funny thing is, the only thing I can really remember is that I'm standing there with Jim on stage. They just done a run through, a sound check, and Ed walks over and says to Jim. He says, Mr. Morrison? And Jim says, yes, Mr. Sullivan. And he says, I think it would be better if you weren't so somber, if you were just reflect more of a good time. And Jim just looked at him and laughed, not out loud, didn't embarrass him. He was a gentleman, but he just couldn't believe that's what he was being asked to do. So he was intense. And
there was that lyric, right? That they
they decided that "Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher" was a drug reference, and therefore we couldn't do it. And so Jim agreed not to do it, and then of course did it. Oh, I forgot.
Right.
And they were pissed off. Vinnie Colaiuta, who was the producer, director, talent guy, was screaming at the managers who were there for that at that time. So God, Sal and Ash were still the managers, so that was the first 6 months.
Uh-huh.
And
that's a storied. Well, it's in the movie. I think right. You'll never do Ed Sullivan again.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey,
and
man.
he said that, and we all just kind of went, "Okay, well, we did it."
Yeah. Hey, man, we did Ed Sullivan. Just great. So, where were you? How did you find out about the passing of Jim Morrison?
I was asleep at my new house in Manhattan Beach with my new wife, And the phone rang at 4:00 in the morning, and it was Clive Selwood, who was the head of our English label. And he called. My wife sat bolt upright and said, "Jim's dead." And I went, "What?" And I said, "Hi, Clive?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why are you calling me at 4 a.m?" He says, "I've had 3 different journalists from France call me for a statement about Jim Morrison's death. Do you know anything?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I'll call you as soon as I can find out." So I started calling the apartment, no answer. And I finally got Pamela to answer. I mean, I called every 20 minutes all day. And finally, somewhere around noon, she answered. And the doors were pretty much estranged from each other at that point. The Light My Fire license, which Robbie wrote, but while Jim had disappeared on us for a week, we had no idea where he was. We got Buick wanted to use Light My Fire in a commercial, and we wanted, everything in the band was all four. And
Right.
This was the first time we'd been confronted with making a decision without Jim. And Robbie just finally said, "Well, I wrote the song. I think it's okay." So we said yes. And Jim came back from wherever he'd disappeared to and was just heartbroken that they would even think of doing that, because that was the counterculture.
Right. Back then it was viewed as
You
selling
didn't
out.
that was totally selling out. You didn't promote products.
Yeah.
Holy crap. That was
Sure.
just completely
That's like giving in to the corporatocracy.
Yeah,
Corporatocracy.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
there was an estrangement, you're saying, within the band at
that
time.
happened, and then they finished L.A. Woman, and he decided that he was maybe done with rock and roll. He wanted to write. He was interested. He had a screenplay in development. He was going to Paris, and I don't know how the other guys felt, but I went, "Great, that's a really good thing for you." And so he moved to Paris, and I talked to him every couple of weeks and kept him apprised of what was going on, with how incredibly well the L.A. Woman album was being received.
And it was being well received, wasn't
It was being very well received. We had an instant top 10 single with Love Her Madly on it.
Sure.
A very interesting moment in the creation of that record. They'd finished the record. It was recorded in my office. Downstairs was their rehearsal room, and upstairs on the other side of my desk was the console that Bruce Spotnick had rented. And so I'd leave the office for the day. They'd come in and make records. That's how L.A. Woman was made.
Wow.
And so I got 24-hour use out of my studio.
Were they prolific? They were in the sense that...
Jim was always writing poetry,
Right.
and then they'd spend a couple of weeks hammering melody into it. But it almost always came from Jim's poetry. The ironic thing is Robbie wrote Love Her Madly, Light My Fire, and one of the other big records. Robbie wrote the hits. Jim wrote the body of work.
Sure.
So they were very productive, but they didn't do a record every 6 months. So anyway, they did the L.A. Woman album, and I had talked to Jim, and he seemed in really good spirits. And then I got that call from Clive. And so when I finally got Pamela on the phone, I said, "Pamela, this comes from pretty reliable sources. I want to help you. I am there for you and for Jim." And she said, "Well, no, it's okay." And I said, "No, Pamela, you don't understand. If Jim died, I am coming to help you. Do whatever you want." So she said, "Okay." And I went straight to the airport and got in a plane and flew to Paris. And I got to the apartment at 6 a.m. the next day, and I didn't want to go pounding on the door at 6 a.m. So I went to a little Starbucks, kidding, but the French
cafe.
idea of a morning coffee place,
Right.
right? Where they all drank half an ounce of espresso
small.
and then had a shot of brandy to go to work. And so I went to the apartment, and the casket was in the apartment, bolted closed. And I loved Jim. He was my friend and someone I admired beyond possibility. I had no interest in seeing him dead, and it just never occurred to me that that was my job. So that allowed the promotion of the myth that Jim's not dead.
I see.
That I didn't make that move.
The The casket was there in the apartment.
In the apartment, yeah.
And it was bolted shut, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was, beautiful light oak,
Right.
beautifully finished, and it had probably 10, big-headed bolts that were in the top, and it just never occurred to me to take the bolts off and make sure Jim was in there.
Sure.
Did
They did that in 24 hours time, and just the time between the death and...
Well, no. I mean, I understand I'm in L.A. It's a 12-hour flight.
Okay.
So
day and a half,
Jim
maybe.
died, I think, Saturday night, and I got there Tuesday morning.
I see. Okay, so there was time for...
Yeah.
Gosh, it is so eerie. And then his grave, he was buried there, right in France.
Yeah, Pam said that Jim had told her they'd been to visit Père Lachaise because many of the great figures in French culture were buried there. Victor Hugo, Edith Piaf.
Sure.
And, just the greatest creatives of French history were in Père Lachaise. And Jim told her, I want to be buried in Père Lachaise. He wasn't thinking of dying. He just knew that if he was going to be buried, that would be where he'd want to go. So we figured out how to make that happen. And they had a really wonderful woman there who was the daughter of the Canadian consul, who was their assistant. And she was very resourceful and, of course, fluent in French and all that. So
they were able to make that process happen. It might have been impossible for anybody else. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what the intent was, to keep it secret. They told when he died, they told the French that he was an American poet and he was there as, to write poetry, and that they gave no hint of who he was culturally. So the officials didn't realize that they had this obligation to share information. So we were able to keep it secret until we buried him. Got him buried, and then I went to the airport and flew home, and went straight to my publicist's office that night and met with Robert Hilburn and Frank from the Herald Examiner, and they both wrote statements for me and explained why it came out that we just didn't want, Pamela was very clear, I don't want the rock and roll circus around this.
Right. I mean, but he died in a rock and roll circus kind of way, in the sense that it fit into the drug abuser box. You know what I mean?
It wasn't.
How did he die?
Well, he may have died that way. There's people that say he died that way.
Sure.
But, the doctor that attended said he died of a heart attack. And Jim was not a druggie.
Right.
You're
saying drink was his
that was what was going to kill him
choice,
if he had enough time.
Yeah.
But he also did everything to extreme. So if he did do a drug that was deadly, he might have done it to extreme. So I don't think it's impossible.
Okay.
But I always just kind of went with, if the doctor said he died of a heart attack, that makes sense to me. None of us thought he'd make 30 because he lived such an extreme way.
Wow. My last question is about Jim Morrison biographical thing, because I just don't know. His folks did he grow up in some, how did he grow? Was he in touch with his parents? Or?
No, he was estranged from his parents.
Okay.
And we had a very funny scene when I was roadie. We did a show in Washington, D.C., and his mom came. And the managers were there for some reason.
Right.
And Sal and Ash, and they looked at me and said, do not let that woman anywhere near backstage. You must keep her out. Got it? I went, yeah, sure. So I'm doing everything to deflect her while still getting the stage set up.
It's funny already.
Yeah, and it was just, he did not want to see her. And he did not want to talk to his dad. So that relationship was over in his brain. And so he actually did the end original version with her in the audience. And the place they didn't know she was in the audience.
Sure.
We all were freaking out that he would sing that with his mom in the room. It was pretty intense. And then that night I left to go to the next town. And as I drove through Washington, I had another kind of emotional epiphany, because I realized our whole country's history is devoted to war. It's all war memorials. everywhere you go. Celebrate war. And I just thought, that's so wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that was the time to maybe come around to those realizations as America was in the middle of one of the most intense wars of the modern era in terms of casualties, in terms of conscription. It was a brutal period.
It was a horrible thing, and it's what really ignited the counterculture. It's what made us all go, screw the government. We don't trust anybody. I mean, it was very easy to stand on one side of that line. You know, to me, it was travel 7,000 miles to shoot somebody.
Right.
No, thank you. They're not threatening us. And I feel the same way today as we're in wars all over the world.
When we come back, I want to ask you about some of the other artists you've worked with and just about that world of rock and roll and music as it's changed through the years. Bill Siddons, our guest.
The Mark Thompson Show. The Mark Thompson Show.
Put it together for Bill Siddons again. Come on.
Yeah, here we go.
That's all I'm talking about. So, Bill, some of the other bands you've been involved with, you mentioned Robert Palmer. As you mentioned these different bands, CS&N, they were Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Would you call that folk rock? What was that at the time? How do they, or is it just called rock at the time, right?
Well, I don't think we were as conscious of trying to divide it into, oh, this
genres.
is jazz over here, this is folk rock. The music, I mean, if you look at so much of the music that happened in that era,
sure,
you know, Traffic.
Oh, right.
What was that, rock and roll? I don't know. There were a number of bands like that, that were all over the map musically. So it wasn't something that we really wanted to define it. But I would say, to me as a fan, they were folk rock. They played acoustic guitars mostly, but they had this killer electric guitar player named Steven.
Right.
And the
harmonies were powerful in that band, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always were.
And the reason I kind of asked about what you would call them is because it seemed like the world of rock was populated by a lot of different sounds. As you say, it felt less segmented than it is. I mean, Hendrix and
and the Airplane and
thank you,
Doors, and there's so many bands, and all of them that lasted. The Stones, the Beatles, Zeppelin, everything from England. The stuff that lasted was completely unique in some way or another. There was a vocalist that sounded like no one else, production that sounded like no one else, guitar players, keyboard players, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. There was all this incredible variety of music that had a beat, which made it rock.
I see.
But most of the time that beat was stolen from the Blacks, you know,
Right.
which is really more R&B in a lot of cases.
Sure.
So it was a very diverse, you know, and you would listen to the radio, whether it was top 40, everything sounded completely different from most everything else. And it wasn't until probably the mid 70s that the record companies got to they got 3 hits. We got to sound like them. And it started to become an ambition. And today, excuse my prejudice, I find that I listen to a lot of pop music, and I am amazed at how I can barely tell it apart.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, creation of many hits that populate pop music now, that creation has been, and you'll pardon my bias, but corrupted by looking for the hook, and the hook could be sent from like some artist in Seattle, and they mix it with something from a guy in Brooklyn, and you know,
They got 20 writers on that
yeah,
song.
Yeah, it's a little like what they've done with food. You know, they've created chemically the food that'll hit your taste bud a certain way and your craving another way. It's, you know, we've Frankensteined everything, including the
absolutely.
music.
Well, you know, if you want to die young, eat in a restaurant every day because it's all sugar and salt. Yeah. Every dish has got 4 times what you need to make it taste good.
So when you look at the, tell me something, just give me, when you look at this world of yours, I just see all these snapshots that I wish, because I was just a kid listening to radio, I wish I had understood some of what went into these moments and these songs. So Robert Palmer, when you were with Robert Palmer, because I thought that was That was also a cultural breakthrough. He had a look, he had a style. It was brilliant. It was almost there was a theatricality to him.
I did basically North American representation. I wasn't his manager. Davey Harper was, and Davey was my roadie for the Doors' first tour of Europe. And we ended up in a fist fight, so we were bonded. And
what were you fighting over?
I think he was fighting over not getting the same hotel rooms that the band got, or something like that.
I see. Okay.
He was a street fighter from Cockney. What is it?
East End or something? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was just an in-your-face kind of guy, and almost unintelligible. But we maintained a friendship for the next 10 years, and I kept telling him, Robert is a million-selling artist. He just has never had the chance. You really need to hire somebody here to make that happen. Doesn't have to be me. I'm not advocating hire me. I'm saying for Robert, you need to hire someone who knows how this market works. And he said, yeah, and blew me off. And we just laughed about it. And then right as Addicted to Love was just about to be released, the Riptide album, I was in London for Thanksgiving, and my first independent lawyer that just represented me, and I was her second client. Her first client was Ben Sidron. Bill Siddons was her second client. She said, I have a very small file drawer. But so Emily was and still is, a dear friend of mine. So one night I went to Emily's, and Davey came over, and we hung out, and I did the same rant on him about Robert could break so big, because he'd had 3 consecutive under the radar. Everybody loved this guy. Every name musician thought Robert Palmer was the bomb. He was just the best. But he sold 300,000 albums. And so January, Davey calls me and says, well, I've signed 4 other acts. I can't do all this work. The first single failed, Riptide. He said, I need help. I said, I'm there. What do you want? He told me what he wanted, and we got to work. And this all condenses down, right? There's hours of talking about working with Robert, but I was friends with a guy named Carter, and Carter was an A&R guy from San Francisco, and he was really close with Les Garland. Les Garland was the new head of MTV. Okay. Right? It was 84.
Okay.
And so, 86. And so I go, well, I can't remember why I went to New York, but when I'm in New York, I got to go see Les. So I went to Les's office and said, hey, Les, I just signed Robert Palmer. And he looked at me with his eyes bugging out saying, oh, man, have you seen the video? I said, no, I'm close with his manager, and he called me and hired me for the U.S. And he says, watch this. And he reached over, grabbed a VHS, stuck it in his machine, and looked at me and said, I'm going to play this 1,000,000 times this year.
Wow.
And I said, well, then my work here is done. and
it'd all be so easy.
That was probably the most impactful video in the history of rock music, because he had those 8 dancing girls and the sleek model thing. It was the coolest visual anybody had ever seen. And Les, to his word, played it until you hated it.
That leads me to exactly what I wanted to ask you about Robert Palmer, which is there's the music, and then there's the style of the video, which you said the exact thing I was going to say, which is what blew him up was that look, that style, the theatricality, as I was saying before.
He was the only guy wearing a finely cut suit and a tie, and
yet
he carved that place
sexy
for himself. Yeah, and it was sexy without being overt.
Right.
And then they hired this photographer in London to do the video, and the guy came up with the idea.
So it was somebody else's idea.
Yeah, it wasn't mine. He found a guy who came up with the idea to do this, and did a great job, and we all couldn't stop looking at it, because the girls were so aloof.
Yeah. It was like they pulled him off of Paris Fashion Week and put him in a video. It was brilliant.
And that's kind of who he was. He enjoyed the finer things in life.
Yeah.
The first gig he did was in Boston, and after the show, we were back in the hotel in the bar, and I just said to the waiter, whatever he's drinking, I'm paying. And so Robert looks over at me, waves, buys a $240 Armagnac.
Well, you started it, right? Right. I also think about bands like America. I mean, they were another. Was it Horse with No Name? Was there?
That was the giant record. Yeah. And in reality, I inherited America from Irving Azoff, who inherited it from Elliot Roberts. Even though they were Elliot's client, Elliot was busy doing Neil and Joni, and really didn't have a lot of input. And so when Irving left, Irving took Joe Walsh, but he didn't take America. They were loyal to Elliot. And then my first day in the office, I had not made money for a year and a half. I had a family. And so I called David Geffen, and Geffen said, would you be willing to work for somebody else? I said, yeah, why? He says, I want you to go talk to Elliot Roberts. I said, okay, why? He says, don't ask, just go talk to him. So I went and talked to Elliot, and I had just made a deal with Chris Blackwell to run Island Artists for him in the U.S., not the label, but the management company. And so I was destined to be Robert Palmer's manager somehow. But what happened was Chris had just made a distribution deal for Island, and he really wanted to get Jerry and Herb, A&M, and show them how to be an artist label, because they owned that turf.
Yeah.
And so he said, that
was A&M Records, right?
Yeah. And they were just kind of blowing up as that label that had all the cool stuff on it and stuck with their artists. And they were the cool place you wanted to be. And so Chris said, I'd really rather not do this whole management thing for a few months. I want to get into place with the record company. I said, cool, whenever you're ready, I'm interested. And literally the next day, I get the call from Geffen saying, I want you to take a meeting with Elliot, which is really what happened, because I'd worked with David on a couple other things. Actually, Post Doors, the Butts Band with Robbie John and Ray, and then Ray left, and it was Robbie John and some English musicians. And Geffen, he had the lead. No, the lead singer was on Island, but we were talking to David about doing the record deal. So he called me and said, I want you to go meet Elliot. So sure, I went and met Elliot, and Elliot said, I got too much going on. I'm doing Neil and Joni. I've got America, Sal de Huma Fury. I'm going to sign another big act soon. And he had Ron Stone working with him. And Ron was like his replica, the street kid from Brooklyn. And I'm the LA surfer guy, culturally completely opposite. But what happened was simply that Elliot said, here's a phone number, or here's the address. I want you to go over. This was on Tuesday, because he made me the offer on Friday, and I spent the whole weekend trying to get a hold of Chris. Say, I don't want to do this if we're really going to do it.
Right.
Because Chris was what I really wanted to do. And so he never answered the phone. I had 3 different phone numbers for him. I called him 30 times, never got a response, and I had to make a decision, and I needed to feed my family. And I went, I have a job offer right in front of me. I have, the right career move over there, but who knows? And how am I going to be a partner with a guy I can't get on the phone for days?
Sure.
So I took the job working for Elliot, and the first day of the job, he hands me a note with an address on it on Sweetser and says, America's doing rehearsals in this apartment. Go over and meet them. Tell them you're the manager. I went, okay. And so I went, and Beckley walks up to me and says, oh, so you're the manager of the month, huh? I didn't have the history at that point to know that they'd been with Harlan and Harlan Goodman, and Anyway, they'd been with two other managers who had left 8 months earlier. Irving came in, was there for 6 months. I came in, was there for 6 months. So I inherited him from Harlan and
God, they went through managers.
Hartman and Goodman. Yeah.
I have to say though that
But they didn't want to go anywhere else. The manager dumped them.
no,
and
it
left.
keeps going. Right? No, I'm not saying that they traded out.
Yeah.
You're right. They didn't go through managers. It's just they ended up.
But
with
I was
manager.
the manager of the month,
Yeah.
and I loved them. Loved working with them. The first thing I put together a whole national promotion with Greyhound and Holiday Inns because the album was called Holiday and it was giving away holidays and all that stuff. And nobody at Warner's trusted me. They wanted to know that Elliot really would approve this because Elliot basically was known as Dr. No. He just said no to most everything.
I see. So that they knew that if they ran it past him, he'd go no.
He might say no.
Yeah.
And I had to promise with my hand on the Bible, no, this is approved. We can do this. So I had this whole campaign set up. We had 2 top 10 records off that album. And the first thing was a European tour. And it was challenging because they were the most boring live act I'd ever seen. And I had to...
They had such a great songbook, but I guess...
Oh, awesome. And great guys.
Yeah.
And so I could do that another hour and a half on them.
Yeah.
And I'm still friends. We went to Italy with Dewey and Penny.
That's terrific.
A few years ago, and we see them a couple times a year. But anyway...
so you told them you have to...
I sat in a hotel room and had an after-show meeting and just said, look, what are you doing up there? And they said, we're making the best music we can. I said, I can hear that on the record. I came to see you live. Tell me how the song came about. Tell me anything. Talk to me. Make me feel like you know we're out there. Because they didn't say a word to the audience. So I was kind of beating them up, trying to get them to engage with an audience. And the second meeting in my room at 11:30 at night, Elliot calls me and says, you got to come home. And I said, and the band was in the room. I said, well, that's a problem, Elliot. You know, I've got some really good stuff happening here and da-da-da. And he says, no, you got to come home. I said, why? He says, I signed the band. You have to represent them. I said, oh. And the guys looked at me and said, okay, what's wrong? And I said, Elliot needs me to come home to manage the band. And they landed in LA after that tour, went straight to the business manager and the lawyer, made sure they wouldn't drop them if they left Elliot. And they left Elliot.
Wow.
And of course, I was with Elliot, so that wasn't really an option. And I'd only worked with him for 2 months at that point. So it was a short relationship.
Sad because you obviously really... Well, you so vibed with them that you're still in touch with and vacation with one of them. So
Robbie Robertson never calls me.
Exactly, those band guys. You're gonna in our last minute, Pat Benatar is a name that means something. You were with Pat Benatar for a hot second, but during the hot second,
6 months
to manage her, not actually with her romantically.
No, no.
6 months. How did that happen? How did you end up with Pat Benatar's band?
Through her business manager and agent. I had Crosby, Stills, Nash with CAA, and they had her, and Rob Light called me and said, hey, you'd be interested in Pat? I said, love Pat.
Sure.
She is great.
Oh, by then she'd already had Hit Me With Your Best Shot and Hell Is For Children. Yeah.
Real hits.
Yeah.
And but her husband was very much in charge of things, and she had a kind of a personal assistant who was a manager who had managed that girl, had that song, Bitch. You'll tell me in a minute. But anyway,
okay.
So she was kind of already surrounded, and I ended up having very little direct communication with Pat.
Meredith Brooks.
Meredith Brooks, yeah. And Lori Levy was Meredith's manager, I think, after that. But she was a pro, and she took really good care of Pat. Pat loved her. So they just, and the husband was very controlling. So there just wasn't really the opportunity for me to build a relationship with Pat. And I made a couple of mistakes that came back to bite. One of them was not a mistake, which was that we got the #1 rock record with Everybody Lay Down.
Right.
And then the record that was the record was Every Time I Fall Back. It was, to me, it was going to be as big as Foreigner. with their big ballads. It was just a great, great song, great vocal. And me and Daniel Glass, the head of the label, were just lined up to go for that song, that record.
Mm-hmm.
Pat and Neil had a different idea.
I see.
They had a song that they thought was the single, and I said, yes, it sounds just like a single, but it's not emotionally compelling like Every Time I Fall Back.
God, that's got to be hard to tell somebody that who cares so much.
It's great. We love it. But and Charles Koppelman, the head of the label, who had nothing to do with them, but he loved that song. So they wanted Charles Koppelman to endorse it. I knew Daniel Glass, who was the head of promotion before he was the head of the label. He knew what a record was and how to break it at radio. And so Daniel and I were conspiring to get Every Time I Fall Back released. Mm-hmm. And they forced the hand and released the song that I've completely forgotten the title of.
Yeah, so
because it was a forgettable but lovely song.
Sure,
you know, and so right as that song failed, and we were going with Every Time I Fall Back, and they fired me. And Daniel dropped the single and dropped working the record because there was no direction.
Very tough situation to be beamed. Yeah. I mean, you have to. I think one of the things that I learned, just thinking about everything that you've done through the years and then settling it out, you have to really handle some very prickly situations to smooth them out, to aggressively handle them when the time is right, and to pull back on the aggression when the time is right. I mean, it's pretty tricky, I think. Yeah.
I mean, the reason I had any success is that I was always looking towards what will make the artist happier and better, not richer necessarily. And so, there were many times when the Doors were about to break up, and I played a significant role in pointing the way to harmony.
Sure. I think that I get that. Now, radio is not as possible as it used to be, right? Radio is fragmented, or is radio still important?
The contemporary audience that radio was driven by now spends at least half their listening time, on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube.
Right.
And therefore, the absolute power of radio is kind of gone away. It's still big. It's still free. Mm-hmm. You don't have to pay $14 a month to listen to it.
Sure.
So it's still, you can't really have a huge record without radio, but you can have a lot of success without radio.
You're so kind. I know I've kept you over time, so I'll let you go, but there's a lot of stuff we left out. And I hope you'll...
the Crosby, Stills, and Nash, 15 years.
I mean, I can't believe I left that out. I wish you hadn't said that. People are going to go, what are you didn't ask him about? So I promise, Bill, before you go, you're moving away to Italy.
We have a house in Italy, and I'm hoping to spend much of the year there.
Yeah.
So you might have to come over and visit.
That sounds great. And getting you back on sounds great, too. Bill Siddons, thanks, my friend. Bill Siddons, everybody. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Mark Thompson Show.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.